I beg you to try it, Patricia.
Let me get this straight, Carla. You disagree on the weapon, you disagree on the number of blows.
Listen to me, Patricia. You dare once in your life.
Hey, people. Trish Wood here, and this is Trish Wood is Critical, like you didn't know that. We've got a really big, important show that is going to require some significant brain engagement from y'all. There's a lot going on in the world right now, and some of it feels kind of subterfuge. So we're gonna talk about the Nord Stream pipeline sabotage at the end of the show. I have a couple of theories. You probably know already what they might be. And we're also going to talk about, at the end of the show too, we're going to talk about what's happening in Iran, those magnificent, magnificent women standing up against the mullahs who hate women and force them to wear those hijabs. I know that some Muslim women choose to wear them, so I don't want to say too much detrimental about the garment itself, but forcing them on women who don't want them is awful and soul destroying. And I'm telling you, they are standing up, and men are becoming allied with them in that fight. A young woman was murdered by the morality police. I mean, there actually is a thing. So we're going to talk about that at the end of the show too, and a little bit about how grotesque it is that the Biden administration is still trying to get a nuclear deal with those folks when they should be trying to force them out like the good people of Iran are. That actually is a human rights struggle that they should be promoting. But of course they don't really, because it's intersectional, right? Maybe people will think it's Islamophobic, so we're not going to support those women. I mean, I hate that kind of thinking. And the modern day feminists who have not been supporting the women of Iran against this because of that idea have no place at my table. I will tell you that right now. I'm just so glad that this is happening. But that is not our main focus today either. Our main focus is, it's both good and bad. It is the avalanche of information coming out now that completely supports the people who warned about vaccines right at the beginning and even before they were approved. The clinical trial process was too short. You cannot do it. You can't prove efficacy. You cannot prove safety in that short of a time. There's a clip of Fauci even saying that way back when he actually cared about science. And now the news is coming out and it's bad all around. The good part of this, the good side of this, I guess is the best way to say it, is that it means that these people like our Prime Minister here in Canada, I know this is a global audience, but everybody in this audience knows about our Prime Minister because he is globally infamous for being a bit of a meathead on this, and worse, actually, not just stupid, but politicizing medicine. He's walking back his support for mandates and all the terrible things he said about the unvaccinated people. I include myself in that bunch now, in a clip that will actually turn your stomach. But I'm going to play it because I'm feeling really brave today. So what we're doing today is this. We're going to do another one of our heavy-duty vaccine shows because the time is right to do it again. There's enough new information now, or information that supports old information, that we must have this discussion. Because look, at Denmark is saying don't take the shot if you're under 50 unless you've got other issues. Here in Canada, we're still giving it to children. I mean, it's ridiculous. Some countries are getting it right. Is the science different in Denmark? I don't think so. I just think that they are not so completely entrenched politically in having their power and their identity wrapped up in these shots, right? So there's a lot going on. What we're doing is this. We have one of the most interesting researchers on vaccines. His name is Joseph Freeman, and you will remember him because he was on the show a couple of months ago. He publicly apologized to Jay Bhattacharya at a meeting where there were a bunch of people. It was recorded on video. Can you imagine that? A scientist apologizing to another scientist in this climate? It was such a spiritual event for me. And what he was apologizing about was being vocally very opposed to the Great Barrington Declaration. Of course, he, like any thinking person, knows they were 1,000% right. So he apologized. The interesting thing about Joe Freeman is that he is also a researcher, and he has done a really, really important study and published peer-reviewed paper on vaccines. It's called Serious Adverse Events of Special Interest Following mRNA Vaccination in Randomized Trials. And we talk about that, obviously. We go through the thesis that generated the paper, and it was essentially this. It was very clever. When COVID hit and they were realizing that it was generating all of these really strange physiologically things, you could get diarrhea, headaches, lung problems. It was this kind of multi-system attack from this virus, right? Well, they learned that that was because of the spike protein. And yet they don't worry about that same spike protein in the vaccine being responsible for all of these kind of seemingly disparate adverse events and reactions that are being documented all around. So he's done a paper with some other highly credentialed people. Anyway, legitimate, big deal, science publication, peer-reviewed. So we're going to talk to him. What's interesting about what he says in the interview, you are going to be blown away by this, is how this paper was fact-checked. Okay, so it was peer-reviewed, which means that people in the industry looked at it. But the fact checkers, they're just grifters. They're not fact checkers. They're grifters. They're there. They're paid to support whatever narrative the government tells them to support. So he has a very good story about what it was like to live through this new era where scientific papers are not only peer reviewed, which is fine, fair ball, but also subject to a lot of grifty, compromised, dishonest criticism from fact checkers, most of whom are not even qualified to be reviewing the paper anyway. I mean, seriously. I mean, I know some people, journalists do. Alex Berenson does. I did back in the day. I can read a paper. I couldn't probably peer review one, but I can understand it. The people doing a lot of the fact checking on these papers have very, very little experience in this field. And what they do to check it is they call up the people that the paper might be criticizing and say, well, is this right or not? And if they say, no, it's not right, then they say, oh, this is not true. I mean, it's just completely absurd. So we're going to do a good long interview with Joseph Freeman about a whole bunch of stuff, the paper, being fact-checked, what it's like to be a scientist in this kind of post-truth world we live in now. We are also going to hear in a minute from Tess Laurie, who was a guest on a future show, but we're going to have a clip from her about another really important paper that just came out by a Dr. Azim Malhotra, who is a kind of a legendary cardiologist in the UK, who was a big vaccine supporter. And then there was I think his father died of an adverse reaction to the vaccine. And he started looking more critically at it, did a couple of studies that just came out. And he's now calling that the vaccines be stopped until all of the official data that attends these vaccines is released for public scrutiny. That is what he's saying. The study, there was two of them, part one and part two. It's called Curing the Pandemic of Misinformation on COVID-19, mRNA Vaccines Through Real Evidence-Based Medicine, part one. There is a part two. Journal of Insulin Resistance, also peer-reviewed, and a very, very scary document. So she's going to weigh in on that. And then we're going to hear more from her. The reason Tess Laurie is weighing in on it, by the way, is because she presented it through a news conference. She presented the paper with Dr. Malhotra. So we're going to be hearing from her. Let me do our pitch so we can move into the body of the show right away. We have so much to talk about. So we are listener supported. And we like it that way. What that means is if you enjoy the show, first of all, please subscribe to it on your podcast listening platform so you get it every week, because we do deposit the show or drop the show, as the kids say, about 7:30, 8 o'clock at night every Friday. We've only missed a couple times in well over 2 years, and that is because I had COVID, so I was too sick. But I didn't miss very many shows, just a couple. Other than that, you will get a show from us come hell or high water, as they say, every Friday night. And you can support us by going to my website, which is trishwoodpodcast.com. There you will find a Patreon button, and you will also find PayPal. I know PayPal is in the doghouse right now because they've been censoring people. Apparently, they have just restored Toby Young at the Free Speech Union and Daily Skeptic. They restored his account. They also restored the account of a group in the UK who were fighting on behalf of kids who had been locked out of school. So, I don't know what they were thinking. Like maybe PayPal had like a drunk board meeting or something, and they started just randomly canceling people they didn't like without thinking about it. But they look bad. And we are moving away from them through the other way that you can get in touch with me for support. And that is through our Substack, which is Trishwood Critical on Substack. And there is a way to subscribe to my Substacks, which I do about 1.5 a week. And just because it's a writing platform, you can, that money also goes to supporting the podcast. And we're trying to move everybody over there very gently because Substack is a very heavy duty free speech platform and we want to support them in any way we can. There's some really good people over there, including Glenn Greenwald and Robert Malone is there. And of course, Alex Berenson is there too. There's a lot of Jessica Rose, who's friend of mine now, and other wonderful people. So a lot of the information that is coming out against legacy media's throne of lies, which it sits on, is coming through some pretty heavy duty thinking and writing at Substack. So do support me there if you feel like it. That would be wonderful. I am going to be speaking and helping to host at the end of October, the Free Speech in Medicine Conference in Bedeque, Nova Scotia. You can find how to join and hopefully attend. It's in Cape Breton. How wonderful. By going to the website, freespeechandmedicine.com, I believe. And come and see us. We'd love it. Jay Bhattacharya is going to be there, Bruce Party, lots and lots of interesting people, and we'll have time to hang out and actually chat. And I would love to meet you guys face to face. So check that out. Chris Milburn, who's been on the show, he's a doctor out there, is putting this on, he and his wife, Julie Kerwin. So do please check out the website. And if you need more information, you can email me and I'll send you out the poster at info@trishwoodpodcast.com. So let's go with our vaccine show. What I want to do is, first of all, play a clip of our Prime Minister. And I want to play the clip of our Prime Minister after reading you a couple of little headlines I pulled here over the last couple of weeks. So obviously the latest one is that here is in the Toronto Sun, breaking: Feds announced Canada's remaining COVID-19 border restrictions. Mandatory vaccines, testing, and quarantine for international travelers will end Friday, and people traveling by air or rail will no longer need to wear masks or undergo health checks as of October 1st. I do believe that means the end of the odious ArriveCan, one hopes. But you know what? The science didn't change at all. What's happening is the science that they claimed existed when they mandated this didn't exist, and now it's coming to fruition based on real-world data. And you know what? The picture is not good. The vaccines do not work to prevent transmission, and they're harming people. Even Albert Bourla, I think he has another case of COVID. Anyway, that's good news that has finally come to an end. The other interesting thing, yes. So this is a how it started, how it's going announcement. So in July of 2021, they were saying no trace of mRNA from the vaccines was found in any sample in breastfeeding women who had received the COVID vaccine. So they all encouraged pregnant women and lactating women to go and get this miracle shot. And guess what happened? Here we go. JAMA Pediatrics, Journal of the American Medical Association, September 27, 2022. Here's what they say. Trace amounts of COVID-19 vaccine mRNAs, meaning spike protein, were detected in the breast milk of some lactating women. Caution is warranted regarding breastfeeding infants younger than 6 months in the first 2 days after maternal COVID-19 vaccination. How mad would you be if you were a new mother who breastfed your baby after getting the shot and being advised, encouraged, compelled almost by doctors and our government that it was all going to be hunky-dory, right? No trace of mRNA. Oh, it's perfectly safe. Don't worry about it. Oh, maybe your baby will get blah, 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 right? This is really bad. This is really, really bad. It looks like everything they said a year and a half ago when they were pushing back at the vaccine skeptics was wrong. And it's not just that it was wrong. This is how you have to think critically about it too, if you don't mind my just saying this. Obviously, if it was wrong, either they didn't know the answer and they were lying and pretending they knew the answer on the safety when they actually didn't, which is what I believe is true. I think it's what I know is true, right? Or they had the science and the science was so inept and badly done and corrupt that they were happy to announce the results of bad science because it was getting the result they wanted. I actually think it's A. I don't think they had it. I think they were lying to encourage people. No news is good news. No, we didn't see anything like that. So, well, it's, just so. These are our children. These are new mothers who are very emotional. I know I cried for 6 months after both of my kids. These poor new mothers trying to do their best, and going along with these absolute fools. It's criminal. It is criminal. And here's another little gem I just wanted to say. This is not current. It's old, but I just think in light of everything we're talking about today, this needs to be said. To protect your family and funeral staff, full vaccination is required to attend funerals. Really? This was in Ontario. Imagine how many people didn't get to go. Oh, I feel like crying. As of September 22nd, 2021, funeral services, including visitations, are part of the Government of Ontario's vaccine passport requirement if held indoors. Well, this is Ontario. Most stuff is held indoors. You have about 5 minutes to do things outdoors. This includes funeral services at funeral homes, cemeteries, crematoriums, if held indoors. Wow. So I wonder how many hearts were broken. Do you remember that shot of the Queen attending Prince Philip's funeral and standing all alone, so tiny in that gigantic cathedral, standing completely alone because that is what the COVID rules demanded of her? Just awful. We have done some terrible, terrible things. In the name of what I only can really say now, as it all comes tumbling down and they all start lying and trying to weasel out, done in the name of tyranny. The expert class is inept. We know that now, and we must never let them have this kind of power again. So let's listen to Prime Minister Trudeau, who did more to hate speech, unvaccinated people like me and you than any other leader in the world. I mean, Biden was bad, but Trudeau wrote the book. I mean, every possible insult. Let's remember, I'm not going to play the insults because I get too upset now. I may one day just do a whole show of Trudeau clips, but right now I can't face it. We were, let's see, homophobic. We were racist. We were anti-vaxxers. We were, I think he said in the French interview in Montreal that we shouldn't even have, there shouldn't be even room for us. They shouldn't make room for us, if I remember. Just the worst possible things. Like we are a bunch of Yahoo hillbillies. That's how he talked about us. And let me just say, we're about to listen to this clip. He never, ever put a caveat on it. All people who refused the vaccine, no matter what their reason, were tarred with the same ugly, hateful brush. Never forget it. This is a low point for prime ministers in this country, maybe world leaders anywhere. It's a new contemporary low. And now he's trying to walk it back. And I hope you people don't let him do it. And I hope that the people, the opposition parties in Parliament don't let him do it either, because what he does in this clip is an absolute lie. Here is Prime Minister Trudeau.
I will always call out unacceptable rhetoric and hateful language wherever I see it. And you will remember in the last election, we saw an awful lot of it during the campaign from people who, and we're not talking about, and I was never talking about people who are hesitant towards a vaccine, but trying to be reasonable about it and trying to stay safe. I was talking about those who were deliberately inciting fear and misinformation and anger and deploying themselves in extraordinarily unacceptable ways. Now, unfortunately, with the way our modern social media and communications world, that was picked up and conflated and extended on. And I'm not going to start to say I was taken out of context, but my point was that there are people who are deliberately trying to stir up hate and intolerance and misinformation. And we do need to call out those folks, even as we continue to do everything we can to reach out in thoughtful, reasonable ways to people who do have worries or concerns and focus on allaying those worries and concerns.
Just nauseating. Absolutely nauseating. I mean, this is the thing about him and all these guys who've been so wrong for so long about everything to do with COVID-19. Every public policy has been wrong. They don't go into detail, right? He can't go into detail. He just says, oh, well, yeah, there were a few people. That's who I meant. He didn't differentiate. And I think what is... and by the way, most people I know, and I know a lot of people who aren't vaccinated, had very thoughtful reasons for not being vaccinated. They weren't nutcases. They weren't hillbillies, as Andrew Coyne called them. Not at all. They actually were reading alternative media. And the other thing he does is he tries to conflate anybody who's criticizing the vaccines as some kind of disinformation, misinformation. Hey, we were right. We were saying be cautious. The clinical trials were too short. You can't declare safety and efficacy in that short of a time. And by the way, from Pfizer, who paid the largest criminal penalty in the history of corporate crime on another product that they were being dishonest about. It boggles the mind that we were ever supposed to trust them. And now on this show, we are trying to show you that it is all tumbling down, and it can't happen quickly enough for me. But I think the other message I want you to take away from here is don't let them get away with it. Don't let that be his last word on this, right? He did a lot of damage. And the other thing I want you to fully understand here is that people's lives were ruined by the public health policies during the pandemic that were introduced by people like him and our public health authorities. They killed people. They ruined people. Generation of children struggling, right? So no, they're not just going to move on. And we can't let them. We can't let that weaselly clip by him stand as the last word. And I hope the opposition goes after them. But I want to just give you a little bit of a taste of what's going to be coming up on a future show. And that is an interview, as I said, with Tess Laurie, who helped Asim Malhotra present his paper, which is titled Curing the Pandemic of Misinformation on COVID-19 mRNA Vaccines Through Real Evidence-Based Medicine, Part 1. The gist of it is, it cannot be said that the consent to receive these agents was fully informed, as is required ethically and legally. A pause and reappraisal of global vaccination policies for COVID-19 is long overdue. Now, that is something coming from Dr. Malhotra, because he was a major supporter of vaccines back in the day. So I'm going to play for you a clip of him. It's kind of like what happened and how it's going now. And the first part of the clip is 2/5/2021. And the next part of the clip is 9/26/2022. And you will hear, as one clip moves into the other, how his opinion of the vaccines has changed.
You were able to say that reassured her?
So, Charlotte, I think you've raised some really important points there. So I think the first thing to say is we need to understand where this vaccine hesitancy is coming from. And when I spoke to Gurinder, I went through all of this. So the first thing is there is some clearly irrational reasoning behind why people don't want to take the vaccine, which is based upon very blatant false information that's circulating on social media.
In conclusion of both papers, there is a strong scientific, ethical, and moral case to be made that COVID-19 vaccines rollout must stop immediately until raw data has been released for fully independent scrutiny.
So that's quite a change. And you can track, he's gone from, in less than a year, saying that people who criticized the vaccine were being irrational, to suggesting there needs to be a pause until we know more, until we can review the data properly. That's no small thing. So the person who helped him present that paper publicly at a kind of a webcast is Dr. Tess Laurie, who has been an absolute giant, in the pushback against some of the, I will say, irrational COVID policies, lockdowns, etc. And she helped present it, and this is what she has to say about what he found.
It's two papers by Dr. Malhotra, Dr. C. Malhotra. And what is so important about these papers is really the context, because they're coming from a doctor who promoted the COVID-19 vaccines on the BBC and quite widely particularly to Black, Asian, and Middle Eastern population in the UK. So it seems like early in 2021, there was, what they call vaccine hesitancy among this particular segment of society. And he was kind of recruited by the BBC to persuade them that the COVID vaccines were safe and effective, and it was in their interest to take the injections. So what's fascinating is that, and he received injections as well. I think he had two vaccinations, and then and his father also. His father was a very senior doctor and the vice chair at one point of the British Medical Association. So Dr. Malhotra is a well-respected cardiologist himself, and so and his father died as a result of the COVID vaccine, the COVID vaccine. So it was only after his father died that they did a post-mortem, because his father was a very fit man, yeah. and Asim knew something was wrong, and so they did a post-mortem. and it showed that he had a really severe heart attack with clots and so on. That just didn't make sense, and so Asim was forced to sort of go through on this personal journey and actually look into the available the evidence on the vaccines. And you and I know that there are a lot of papers now and a lot of data on the pharmacovigilance databases that show unprecedented numbers of adverse reactions and also association with harm. So he's kind of gone on this journey. He's written it up. The papers themselves are quite personal, involve a lot of his personal story and his personal journey. And what is remarkable is just having this man, come forward from a position of promoting the jabs to now really fully convinced that the COVID vaccines are causing harm and that they must be recalled.
And he's calling for a pause, is he not?
Absolutely. He's saying they must be paused. We need a full independent evaluation. And he's also fully aware and speaking out about the likelihood of fraud in the Pfizer and other clinical trials. So it's really remarkable. And of course, the mainstream media, which were really using him in the first few months of COVID with the rollout of the injections, they're now discrediting him and so on.
So that was Dr. Tess Laurie, who is going to be in an upcoming show talking about Dr. Malhotra's study and many, many other things. She's a big supporter of ivermectin, and she produced once a video about a paper she wrote with another doctor and how the paper didn't turn out the way she had anticipated, and they had a really painful discussion about it that is kind of a highlight of all of the science debate, in my view, or science that should be being debated during COVID-19. So she's got a full show coming up soon with us, but I just wanted her to weigh in on this vaccine show with what Dr. Malhotra discovered. So let's move now to our main stage for today. And this is my old friend, Joseph Freeman. Dr. Fraiman is an ER doctor in Louisiana. He works in hospitals. He rotates through hospitals in some of the poorest areas of Louisiana. So he did see, as a frontline doc, a lot of the early fatal cases of COVID-19, that big kind of cluster that happened right at the beginning. And he, as I said earlier, he was sort of a fan of lockdowns and then realized, as smart people do, that he'd made a mistake. And he's also, aside from that, though, a very highly regarded researcher. And he's done a paper called Serious Adverse Events of Special Interest Following mRNA Vaccination and Randomized Trials. I gave you a hint at the beginning today about the genesis of it. It's quite smart, and he has a lot of interesting things to say about his study, what it means, how difficult it is if you're trying to publish papers that are going against the current accepted narrative, the whole shebang. This guy is just almost incapable of being dishonest. He answers every question, no matter how tricky. He's just wonderful. So here is my interview with Dr. Joseph Freeman on his paper looking at adverse events of special interest after the COVID vaccine. Hi, Dr. Freeman. How are you?
I'm very good. Very good today.
That is good. I'm really, really keen to talk to you about this study that you people have done. I saw the preprint and was interested then, and you guys declined. I'm assuming because it was a preprint then. Is that right?
Yeah, as a group, we decided to not go to media while it was still a preprint. We wanted to have it peer-reviewed before speaking with media about it, just because as you run it through the peer review process, you might discover, problems with it that you didn't realize. So it's, the purpose of the preprints in general are to share it with the scientific community. And we felt it was best to wait until it's peer reviewed.
Yeah, it's probably a smart move given how much flack everybody takes if they find something that goes against the current approved narrative.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I just want to before we get into what the study found, I just want to talk to you about the time that we're living in, because I've been researching what you found, but the other part of the story is also how people reacted to what you found. And it really feels like the olden days of scientific discovery and debate are now trashed. And that it's kind of like what I just said, if you produce a paper, no matter how well researched, it is provocative in a way that it shouldn't be to these people we now call the fact checkers. I mean, the response to this thing was it's weird. It makes me very, very unsettled about scientific endeavor these days. It really does.
Yeah, no, the fact checker response to our article, it really kind of changed my entire view of just fact checking in general. Our article, which was fact checked by multiple different fact checking sites, their source, one of their sources was a YouTube video, for example.
I know.
But the thing is, the seriousness of this is that it blocks people from having access to it through social media. And the implications of what fact-checking has ended up doing to our society, it's one piece of a much larger problem, but it's a very obvious point. So you have these fact-checkers who, prior to COVID-19, no one really respected them. They were kind of second-rate journalists who were writing opinion pieces on websites that were called fact-checking. But there's a survey I know from 2016 where something like only 29% of people believe fact-checkers. So we had 71% of our population not believing it because their only access to it before was through reading these poorly written articles.
Yeah.
Then when social media got involved and started using them as the basis for labeling things as misinformation or fully censoring articles or statements, it led to a total change, because now every newspaper or news organization doesn't want to publish anything that will actually get the label of misinformation or be censored, because that prevents their business model, which is they need more clicks for each article.
Right.
It prevents every academic or public intellectual from speaking openly on a topic, because getting mislabeled, getting that label, it's the misinformation label. It's harmful to your reputation. It can ruin it could cost you your job. So you now are stuck with our newspaper journalists interviewing experts, and they're seeming to get a consensus because there's no expert, there's few academics or public intellectuals who are going to go on the record and say anything that could potentially be labeled as misinformation. And then in general, how do these fact checkers work is they find information, and people are, for example, questioning something the CDC or the FDA found. And then they go to the CDC and FDA and ask them, oh, is this correct? And they go, no, of course not. Look at what we said. And then that's the end. That's the end of our fact checker. So it's basically the CDC and the FDA and various other governmental organizations have ended up with a situation where they have an arm that's essentially censoring anyone who disagrees with their views.
Well, it's really interesting, because what that scenario exposes is the fact then that nobody's being held to account. In other words, where journalists used to critique the CDC and the FDA, if the CDC and the FDA are now the source for the fact check, then it means that nobody's holding accountable the very kind of pillars of democracy that are supposed to be monitoring what's happening with pharmaceutical products and medical devices.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's a major problem that somehow we need as a society to fix this, because we can't have a democracy where any article that goes against the government is going to be labeled as censored or misinformation. We're not able to function that way. It's a huge problem, and I didn't realize kind of how big it was, because before I always thought of fact checkers as just kind of these silly articles that were written, but they actually have large implications.
They do. Well, I know that they used fact checkers in the Hunter Biden laptop story, and regardless of how you vote, the Hunter Biden laptop story has been proven demonstrably to be authentic. It was known to be authentic at the time, but there were conversations had by people in the Democratic Party with the social media organizations about not running that story. So regardless of how you vote or the meaning of that for anybody personally, that's really, really dangerous, because it means that the so-called fact checkers and big tech are there primarily to support a political narrative and not the truth. So they're not fact checkers at all. They're not checking facts as far as that goes. They're actually supporting what seems to be the approved political narrative at the time. And sadly, the approved political narrative right now is that vaccines are, to use the mantra, safe and effective. So no matter how good your research is, I believe, I'll say this, I don't know if you'll agree with me, but I'll say it after a year and a half of covering vaccines, that no matter how good your study is, the fact checkers are going to come for you in one way or another. Do you believe that's true?
Yeah, they essentially, they have already, they only fact check in one direction.
Right.
And
right.
so that's another problem of this. So for our article specifically, we had people who were definitely exaggerating our findings online, where they were quick to judge them. But then we had lots of people who were minimizing our findings, and they'll never fact check the people who are minimizing our findings. So it's really only a singular direction. And, you know, I don't think there's ever been a fact checking article that I could think of that questioned one of some sort of study that's looking at the efficacy of the vaccine. Yeah. So it's really one-sided sort of fact checking.
Yeah, and do you ponder what is really going on here? Because I must say, the longer I do this and the more obvious it becomes, I mean, there's no doubt in my mind now that it is the fact checking thing is corruption. There's just no two ways about it. And that gives me a lot of anxiety about how we are supposed to live in this age of very, very corrupted and one-sided narratives that can't be challenged. Even if if we're talking about vaccine side effects, it's life and death for people. And even that doesn't seem to trump the fact checking and the one-sided coverage of it's just nuts.
Yeah, I think it began during a time of mass hysteria, in a sense, where there was definitely, I'm sure, lots of false information going around online, but a large amount of that false information was actually coming from our own government. And so, but there were also tons of, people on the internet, random people who were, I'm sure, posting lots of information that wasn't necessarily true. And people got nervous that it was going to hinder our efforts at fighting COVID. So I think it came from that. But, I can't say that there's this large, the way that it's worked out is definitely very problematic, how it's turned into at least this essentially government sanctioned censorship machine. But I'm not sure if, as it was being created, as social media was institutionalizing it, that they realized exactly how wide these implications are and what it really was doing to our society.
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree with you about that. I think that, especially given what I know now about how legacy media has covered the whole thing, that the idea that the vaccine is safe and effective as a kind of a mantra that's chanted in newsrooms. I interviewed a reporter who quit CBC up here because of the way they were covering COVID and vaccines specifically, that you couldn't, this is the thing about it that's so weird. You couldn't criticize the vaccines because apparently if you did, it would cause vaccine hesitancy. But as a former reporter, I would say, well, yeah, if the vaccines are causing adverse reactions, people should be somewhat hesitant when they are evaluating the risk-benefit ratio, right? But the people even saying that to justify the non-coverage of negative information about vaccines were saying journalistically, essentially, that their role was to support vaccination and not a critical analysis of what the vaccines were actually doing, which I found very troubling.
Yeah, I think it has to do with just a kind of almost a forgetting of the concepts of informed consent, and that these medical ethics. And I don't know how public health, for example, applies the concept of informed consent. But when I have to do a procedure for a patient, even when I think it's the correct procedure that will benefit them, I'm supposed to discuss with them what are the harms, what are the potential harms, why I believe this is of benefit for them, but understanding that with every intervention comes these harms. And with even the concept of informed consent, just by me explaining these things to people, I'm sure that it, as a whole, will lead to some people making the decision that I don't think is in their best interest. That I've already recommended this therapy, and I've explained the harm. Now I'm explaining the harms as my obligation, my duty.
Yeah.
And sometimes people will hear those harms and possibly decide that they shouldn't get the intervention. Now, that is clearly maybe they're making the right decision for them in that situation, but it's not what, me as their physician is recommending. So it's with this whole idea of it telling people things that are, okay, here's a possibility of harm. We're uncertain even on it, but just by saying it, that it'll create vaccine hesitancy. But by not telling people the truth, you're not allowing informed consent. You're not allowing a doctor and a physician and a patient to have a conversation, this shared decision making, to decide on what is the best therapy for them.
I just want to ask you a personal question before we get into this study, and that is this: are you shaken up by fully being able now to take on board what's been happening for the last couple of years in the field in which you exist, which is medicine, but you're also a researcher?
Yeah, I think that a lot of it is more of what was already happening. And it was happening, I think, before COVID. It just kind of became a bit more extreme. So I don't think that, that it's just more of the same. And that before COVID, the FDA was still kind of pushing drugs through that were probably a little bit not had been tested as well as they should have been. And this has been, and the CDC has been, promoting things that are not necessarily as evidence-based as they can, but they're, getting paid by various companies to promote various public health interventions that coincidentally the company paying them also has the product that serves that need. And so I think that these problems were already present, and they've just become way more obvious, especially to the public, because now so much of these healthcare questions which were kind of just discussed amongst physicians and scientists are now being discussed in the public.
Yeah. Let's talk about your study now. I'll get back to some of this stuff after we go through what you people have discovered. So let's just talk about the study itself. It's called Serious Adverse Events of Special Interest Following mRNA COVID-19 Vaccination in Randomized Trials in Adults. And that was published eventually where? Which journal?
It was published in the journal Vaccine.
And that's one of these, is it Elsevier?
It is.
Publications? Okay. And your co-authors, your lead author on it, I see, is Juan Everti, Mark Jones, Sandra Greenland, Patrick Whalen, Robert M. Kaplan, and Peter Doshi. So I guess I'll ask you personally, what prompted you to want to do this study in the first place?
Well, when the vaccines first came out, I had read through the FDA briefings for both Pfizer and Moderna. I was doing a summary for a physician article about them, a physician article on the NNT.com. It's a physician-run website that summarizes information on medical diagnostics and therapeutics.
Yeah.
And at the time, I had not, caught anything that raised my eyebrows about a concern for adverse events. It wasn't until several months later when they discovered that the spike protein was causing harm. Because initially my concern for adverse events came from the novelty of the messenger RNA platform. And then to discover months later that the protein they used of what the messenger RNA vaccine was going to have our bodies create, to find out that was a toxin that causes the exact same things that all the strange things we learned COVID did. When every week we'd learn like, oh, whoa, COVID causes heart attacks. That's weird. COVID causes blood clots in your lungs. That's strange. COVID causes all these. COVID causes diarrhea. COVID causes vomiting. It started being this strange sort of. It was very unusual to learn that from an infectious disease to be hitting all these different systems. And so once we learned that it was a spike protein, that's when I became much more concerned. The general message that came out after that was, oh, no, don't worry, the spike protein of the vaccine is safe and the spike protein of COVID is harmful. And we designed the vaccine to be safe because that's not true. They didn't know that the vaccine, the spike protein was harm when they designed the vaccine.
Right.
So it wouldn't have even been possible. And the fact that was being said made me question what was going on here. And so decided with Peter Doshi and these other authors that a great way to kind of look through this was we found this list, this Brighton collaboration list, which creates adverse events that you would expect to see from the vaccine. And it's based on what you've seen with other vaccines, but mainly it was all the different things that COVID causes. And the Brighton collaboration, they create this list for all vaccines. They did it before the clinical trials. And so they created this list and we said, let's take this list and apply it to the COVID vaccine, sort of to take a magnifying glass at the clinical trials and get a better look at exactly if these adverse events that we would expect to happen as this group who's the professionals at figuring out, oh, what are the adverse events we should look for? Let's see if we can find a difference in the actual clinical trials.
Right. So who is the Brighton group? Who are they?
The Brighton collaboration, they create essentially adverse event lists of special interest for vaccines.
I see.
And this one specifically, they had created it as the trials were going on. The World Health Organization endorsed them. So we figured that they would be a non-controversial list to use.
Yeah. I think it's very interesting that the way you approach this, because you looked at it kind of mechanistically, right? That if the spike protein does this as part of the virus in the human body, and we don't like the things it does, why wouldn't it, as part of the vaccine, be doing some of those similar things? That seems hugely logical to me. And I guess I'll ask you, why did you question that, and other people maybe who should be questioning that have not been? I know that early on people who were saying we should worry about the spike protein for that in the vaccine were really ridiculed for thinking that way. And I'm just wondering why something that it seems so logical to me. Why do you think other people didn't look at it that way?
I really am not certain why other people didn't, other than what I was saying. And I'm not certain that other people didn't. I know that other people weren't talking about it publicly. And this comes back to what we were speaking about before with fact checkers. So the CDC on their website said, if you say the spike protein of the vaccine is unsafe, that's misinformation. So if you came out saying it, you would be labeled as, spreading misinformation. It would potentially, it would definitely hurt your, public respect and potentially hurt your jobs. So I think that when you say that no one was coming out, no one believed it. It's really hard to know what the different academics believed during this time period, because their words were being monitored quite closely. And if they spoke out against this, and in fact, actually, even in our article, we very much didn't want to discuss spike protein very much in the article as our inspiration, as like kind of this is how we started thinking about this, because of the controversy that's associated with it, which is really a silly controversy. It makes a lot of sense to be concerned, and it might not be a problem. It's possible that it's not a problem, but to start with, oh, don't worry about this definitely isn't going to be a problem. It seems a little reckless to me.
Yeah. Well, I didn't mean nobody had talked about it. Certainly some people did speak up early, like Byron Bridle is one of the people who did. And he was seriously trashed for even just suggesting the issue. So I think what you people have done is really interesting, because it's almost, can I say it's airtight? Like, obviously, no one can say that a study is 100% correct. Science doesn't exist that way. But this is a very credible take on what might be going on, right? Like, it's something to be debated sensibly, as opposed to the people who spoke up really early and were attacked for it.
Yeah, I think that it's clearly the study itself does raise concerns that the messenger RNA vaccines may be causing harm, much more harm than we had initially anticipated.
Okay, so let's talk about what you found. And I don't mind if you get a little bit technical about it, but give me, first of all, the kind of conclusion. What kind of harms did you find? How significant were they? And how frequently were they occurring in people who were getting the shot? And then after we do that, I'll talk to you about what your methodology was for determining those numbers.
Okay, yeah. So essentially our study found when we were looking at serious adverse events. And just to make it clear what a serious adverse event is, it's essentially it's a defined term by Pfizer and Moderna both defined it in their trials. We use essentially their definition, which was identical. It's death, life-threatening at the time of the event, inpatient hospitalization or prolonging the hospitalization, causing persistent, significant disabilities, or basically a medically important event based on a medical judgment. These are serious adverse events. This isn't a fever. This isn't like a fever. The problem here is people get confused because there's the term severe adverse events and serious. Severe adverse events are different. We're rating them on a scale of 1 to 5. So if you have like a really severe headache, that would be, and it's rated as a number 5, then that becomes a severe adverse event. But serious adverse events actually have implications from a medical perspective. And so we took all the serious adverse events in the trials and then individually looked at each one to see if it fit onto the adverse event, this Brighton collaboration list, the adverse events of special interest. And what we found was that in both the Pfizer and Moderna trial, it seemed that there were an increase in the number of these adverse events of special interest. And when you combine both Pfizer and Moderna, the results are quite clear that there's an excess number of these serious adverse events of special interest in both messenger RNA trials. And it came out to about at the rate of 12.5 per 10,000, which is a very, very high rate compared to especially other vaccines. So typically when we think of other vaccines, we're talking about a rate of about 1 in a million. Wow. And this would be over 1,000 in a million. So to compare it even to something that people maybe even have a loose idea of, like the serious adverse event rate for skydiving is 2.3 per 10. It's 2.3 per 10,000. For each skydive is 2.3 chance per 10,000. So
wow, I thought it was less dangerous than that. I'm not doing it.
So this is not a totally, it sounds like a very low number, but it's actually quite high, especially for a vaccine that we're delivering to an entire population.
Well, it does seem high because the pushback on myocarditis was always much, much higher than that, as I recall. Early on, yes. When that first surfaced, they were pushing back, and the argument was, the myocarditis in people is much less than the myocarditis caused by the vaccine, right? Instead of actually, yeah. and they weren't comparing those vulnerable to a myocarditis outcome from the vaccine. They were, I forget what you call it. There's a word for it when you lump everybody in, regardless of their possible vulnerability to the thing you're talking about, right? So, yeah.
Yeah. With the myocarditis thing, they said your odds of COVID-19 are higher with, the odds of myocarditis from COVID-19 are higher than your odds from the vaccine. Yeah. But the major study was in the New England Journal that looked at that was they compared ages 16 to, whatever is the top age, it was probably 90 something. Instead of comparing the group where it's much more common, which is I think about ages 12 to 40. Yeah, in males specifically. Males,
yeah. You were talking about the prevalence that you discovered. So spell that out for me in really clear terms about what the prevalence of what you are calling serious adverse events are. And then tell me what the adverse events actually are that you were looking at.
The prevalence, it's 12.5 in 10,000 for the vaccination series for the first 2 doses. And so I guess another way to look at this is we did a kind of a harm benefit analysis, which is, I think has been misunderstood maybe a little bit in general public how it's discussed. It's because we found that we looked at the ability of the vaccine to reduce hospitalization in the clinical trials. And we found that both for Pfizer and Moderna, it was causing serious adverse events at a higher rate than it was reducing hospitalizations.
Wow. So
the problem here was that the trial was cut short. Okay, so how to interpret this exactly? It's not as clear cut as, we proved that the vaccine's clearly more harmful than it is beneficial. That's not what our harm benefit analysis really should. The takeaway should be it's much more should demonstrate the fragility of the harm benefit ratio. And what I mean by that is there are so many things that could influence this harms and benefits in one direction or the other. For example, if the trial was longer, it would have maybe led to an increase in the number of hospitalization reductions. And then we would have seen maybe an overall benefit, or there could have been a bigger surge of COVID during the trial that led to more hospitalization reduction, and then we could have seen the benefits outweigh the harms, or they could have tested it in a population that had a higher risk of hospitalization, and I presume it would have been more benefit would have been seen there. But then on the contrary of that, if we have a situation where a variant comes along that causes less hospitalization, or we have a variant that has where the immune breakthrough is happening and we're having lots of breakthrough infections and the vaccine's then less effective, or if you just take a population who's at lower risk of hospitalization, then that would push the harm benefit analysis towards harm. And the problem that I see is that we know that with Omicron, it has hit those factors for a variant that causes less hospitalization and that the vaccine's less effective against it. So we're actually now in the situation where that would actually push this harm benefit ratio more towards harm.
That's really interesting you would say that, because when Omicron first surfaced, we interviewed Dr. Coetzee from South Africa, who was the person who kind of reported it and got a lot of attention for reporting it. And she said, it's mild and not too much to worry about. And then somehow it became this big scary thing and everybody was going to die and stuff. But in the end, in hearing that the vaccine with Omicron was preventing hospitalization, I mean, it seemed kind of obvious that if the virus itself in this mutation is milder, how do you know if it's the vaccine preventing hospitalization or it's just a milder virus? Like, nobody ever asked anybody that question in a public forum.
Also, using observational data to determine if hospitalizations are reduced is not really the best way to do this. The differences between people who get vaccinated and people who don't get vaccinated are large. For example, I would imagine that smokers there's probably a larger percentage of smokers in the unvaccinated population. I know I've heard that in many states, there's the obese are more likely to be unvaccinated, for example. So
really? Why do you think that is? Behaviorally speaking,
I don't think I can comment on exactly why it's happening the way that it is, but the fact is that it is happening. So and then the third problem of these observational trials is that if you're going to do an observational study with 1 million people, you could do it in 1,000 different locations in the world. There's been 1 billion people, several billion people who've taken this vaccine. So you have a choice of 1,000 places. So if you find a place where the vaccine isn't reducing hospitalization, I wish you luck trying to publish that. Now, if you find in your location, you have a great reduction in hospitalization, you're going into one of the big boy journals And so it's really we have a massive publication bias here with these observational data. So it has to be interpreted with great caution. We can't just presume because a couple of observational trials have found this, especially with the fact that the groups are different and that there's a publication bias, that we can be certain that we're seeing this that the vaccine is certainly reducing hospitalizations with Omicron.
That's really interesting that you talk about the publication bias, because if that is known, obviously it is probably quite well known in your circles, then why would anybody spend a lot of time on a study that isn't going to find what the journals are publishing too? Like, isn't that kind of self-editing as well?
It's definitely, there'll definitely be self-editing too, because it's why are you going to spend time trying to publish something that's going to ruin your career?
Yeah. Why do you think the journals are doing that? Have you thought about that?
I think it's the same as what we were saying before, in that they're not looking to, I think it's a combination of they're concerned probably about the vaccine hesitancy issue.
Yeah.
They're going to get attacked, and their articles may be labeled as misinformation. They may end up being forced to retract it just from public, outcry. Retracting journals is not something anyone wants. If you're a journal editor, it's not anything you want to do. So you can simply pass the buck on that one. For our paper, we were rejected 5 times before we got it published, and 4 out of the 5 were just rejected flat out. And essentially, with the classical, just we get thousands of articles submitted, and so I'm sorry, yours is we didn't choose yours, essentially arguing that, there are these other articles that you got sent to you that are more important than ours. And I just remember just thinking, like, whoa, you guys, your next journal must have some pretty impressive articles in it, that you think that these other articles that you're about to publish are more important than this one, because this one seems pretty important. And we knew that it was important, because when you're submitting to a journal, you never know if you just think your article is important, or if you're just, lying to yourself, fooling yourself. And with this article, before we even had the preprint, we felt a responsibility to our regulatory body, our safety monitoring, and we contacted the FDA and the EMA. And the FDA and the EMA, both of them, their top officials in vaccine monitoring, we met with all of their top officials for a pretty long time, where they seriously discussed our article. Peter Marks, one of our top vaccine, directors, was in this meeting with us. And so if the FDA is taking this article that was not even published, sent to them as serious enough to meet with us for an extended time and go through it, even if they walked away not concluding that they necessarily agree with it, the fact that journal publications could think that, this isn't important enough to put out into the public, when the FDA thought it was important enough to meet with us and discuss it in detail.
What did they think? What did they tell you?
Their critiques of it were one of the major ones I find is strange is basically is the observational data doesn't back this up, is one of the things they said, which is to me an absurd idea, because you can't use observational data to push away increases in harm in a study. You can use observational data sometimes to identify new rare harms. But in our study, we identified a large number of very, very common types of harms. Our AESI list has a lot of coagulation disorders, such as blood clots in the lungs, strokes, and also bleeding, like brain bleeds, and various types of bleeding and heart attacks. And so the problem is that those are relatively common things, so when, for example, compared with myocarditis, which is very rare, you can go years without seeing myocarditis in the ER. And if you saw myocarditis, you're trying to figure out what happened. How did this happen? And you would always probably get to, I took the vaccine last week. That's strange. And that would get reported. But I don't even think when someone's having a heart attack and I'm rushing them off to the cath lab to get a stent placed in their heart, I wouldn't think of even at that moment asking, when were you last vaccinated? It's not something that's on my mind because it's not something I would presume to necessarily be connected to the vaccine. So these using the observational data to critique this, and it would be also our rate of harm. It's an increase of about 30-something percent, 40%. And so if you have with myocarditis, it had probably a 500% increase. Okay. Wow. But the thing is, it's rare. Myocarditis is very, very rare. So increasing it by 500%, if you increase the chances of a heart attack by 30%, that's going to be way more common than myocarditis happening at 500% fold higher. So so when something happens at 500% right after the vaccine, then you're like, okay, what else could this be? You don't have to think about it. It's most likely caused by the vaccine. But if you have a small increase in heart attacks, for example, is that the vaccine, or is like we were saying before, or is the vaccine group just slightly different in some way or another? Maybe people who are prone to heart attacks are just more likely to are a little bit more likely to get the vaccine. And that's why we're seeing the 30% increase. You can't really be certain from the observational data if you have a small increase, as we're showing in our trial.
Right. But your number, let me just look at your number here. So you have an AE for each 800 vaccine recipients. Is that right? Is that what you're? Yeah,
that's about right for the adverse events of special interest.
Okay. And then I also read when I was reading about your study that the Department of Health and Human Services reports other vaccines. It's 1 or 2 per million. So this is a much bigger number than we traditionally see with vaccines that are in use, right?
Yes, there's no other vaccine remotely close to this. None that have been released. Even I can't even think of any that have been released and then taken off the market. I know for rotavirus, they took it off, the original rotavirus vaccine, they took off the market for having about a 1 in 10,000 chance of causing a disease called intussusception. It's basically that your intestines telescope on top of each other. Ooh. And it's definitely not a good thing, but it's very easily treatable.
Okay. It sounded horrific.
I'm sure it's very painful, but it's
don't
easily
want telescoping intestines.
You don't want it. You don't want it. And we took it off the market for that rate.
Yeah. What's interesting to me also is, and this is what I've been struggling with in doing shows on the vaccine. We've done a few, and we've been super responsible about it too, I'm proud to say, is that there doesn't seem to be, aside from really the myocarditis, there doesn't seem to be an adverse reaction in where doctors can say, this looks vaccine related. I feel like if the vaccine was just causing one thing, and we saw a huge increase in that one thing, aside from myocarditis, that doctors would be more likely to then report it as a vaccine adverse event, right? But it seems that there's a multitude of things. And does that make it harder then to identify what is causing the problem?
Yes, very much so. Especially to get to that one, the 12 and 10,000, the 12.5 and 10,000. If we just can make it simpler, it's we could say 10 and 10,000, right? For simplicity purposes, and it's made up of maybe 10 or 20 different adverse events, all happening at a rate of 1 in 20,000 or 1 in 10,000. But you add them all up together, and then you have your chances of a serious adverse event can be 1 in 1,000.
So just to be kind of practical about what this looks like, because the other problem with the adverse events connected to the vaccine, I would say outside of myocarditis, especially in young men, is that because there's no easy identifier of it, we are watching things transpire that are not only not just being reported, but that are not being ascribed to the vaccine more generally. So I think it's hard for people to grasp what's actually going on. It's kind of like if a tree falls in the forest, right? And nobody says it, is it really happening? And I think because it's not reported in the news media in a way that identifies what the problem is, people aren't paying attention to it.
Well, yeah, it's similar to with Vioxx, it was only heart attacks was the problem they found. Yeah. And even that, it was difficult to find because it only increased them at a small rate. And so then someone who's taking Vioxx has a heart attack. How do you know? Is that a Vioxx heart attack or just a regular old heart attack that they would have had anyway?
Right.
You can't distinguish between them. The reason we ended up discovering it with Vioxx was essentially similar to our study, not exactly the same, but the clinical trials were reinterpreted to find that the original trial did clearly show an increase in heart attacks. And then there was also a second randomized controlled trial that did show the increase in heart attacks. And I think that with these vaccines, a second randomized controlled trial seems unlikely at this time for the full course. But at the same time, we easily throughout this past year and a half could have been doing comparative studies of comparing all the different vaccines that are approved in our country. And none, I haven't seen a single trial that's done a randomization to Pfizer or Johnson & Johnson or Novavax or Moderna in any way. And that I can't think of any reason why we wouldn't want to know which is the best, which is the least harmful. Why would we not want to have that information? And then recently with the booster, as we're moving into, as I was talking about with Omicron, the fact that it is less likely to cause hospitalizations, that throws off the harm benefit calculation that that we have from our study and makes it potentially more likely to cause harm. And so it would be prudent for approving a new vaccine for Omicron to do a large randomized trial, and instead they've done it now with a mouse study instead of a human study, which it's definitely the wrong time to be doing that when this information's coming out.
Absolutely. Well, what's interesting about that also is that exactly the things that you are talking about are the things that prescribing docs should be looking at and saying, well, gee, you're 25 and you're thin and in good health. It's probably you shouldn't be taking this vaccine. But doctors are actually told not to deal with the vaccine in that way and to not to do those kind of analysis, which seems quite strange to me. Why they wouldn't? I mean, isn't that what doctors do? Don't they look at the data and say, I don't think you need to take this?
I think that's what doctors are supposed to do. Yeah. I think that over the years, many doctors it's become very institutionalized, and a lot of doctors are simply following guidelines, and they're not necessarily evaluating it for themselves. They're just, going into work, getting paid and going home. I think that's a pretty common thing. That doctors who are really independently analyzing each trial for each medication are just a subsection typically of academic centers.
Yeah, well, I think COVID has really exposed that. And I interviewed somebody a couple of weeks ago who said that medicine now is following guidelines more generally. He said that's just sort of how it's done, which is pretty terrifying. I want to ask you about the risk benefits of what you found. So risk benefit ratio simply means this, that if you are a person, say you're the 25-year-old guy who's in really good health and not obese, that is a different ratio than if you were somebody who, if you got the vaccine, you might die, right? So explain exactly in the simplest terms how one would calculate that ratio in those two cases.
Yeah. So if you're a young, healthy individual without COVID-19 risk factors, if you're 20-year-old male, your odds of being hospitalized for COVID are quite low. They're certainly, they're probably over a 6-month period, which is what we're dealing with the vaccines in between boosters. They're probably somewhere in the 1 to 5,000, if not even more rare than that. They're quite uncommon. And so then if the vaccine is causing harm at the rate that we're seeing here, the problem is that we actually don't know if the vaccine's causing harm at the same rate for all age groups. And that's one of the major pieces of our study that we asked the Pfizer and Moderna to release their information, because we can't figure it out based on the data is not public. And so we know this amount of serious adverse events occurred in each group, but we don't know how old they were. We don't know what risk factors they had. So we can't figure that out, and they're refusing to release this data. How can that even be legal for them to refuse to release the data in such an important matter? I don't understand. It doesn't seem like it should be. I mean, it clearly is legal, but it doesn't seem. It seems that we should, as a society, I think that we should be questioning this, how this is happening. Even for a regular article that a random study, you have to be fully transparent with your data now for most journals, and you'll see most journals having these supplemental sections filled with spreadsheets of data, as becoming a standard of just regular small-time scientists whose study probably doesn't even mean very much. And to have the clinical trials that we're relying on for a drug that's about to go into the entire, like we're recommending it go into the whole world immediately, to not have that data open for people to analyze and to independently analyze is dangerous. It's really inappropriate. Now, did your study analyze, I know you looked at serious adverse events. So did you analyze specific events and how much more frequent they are in people who've had the vaccine, very specifically certain health issues? Yeah, we teased out the various adverse events for sure. It ended up being a large amount of very different adverse events, as we expect we saw with COVID-19, where it was causing all these different sorts of strange events. And that's exactly what we saw. There is a large, they're not the majority, but the largest number of serious adverse events that are heavier in the vaccine group, or it would have been the coagulation disorders, what we would call the coagulation, the Brighton collaboration defined as the coagulation disorders, which includes increased clotting and also increased bleeding. So problems of the coagulation system. Wow. So I'm looking here, let's go down, anaphylaxis, encephalitis, acute kidney injury, acute liver injury, acute respiratory distress, coagulation. That's your big number there, right? Myocarditis, and then other forms of acute cardiac injury. And so I guess I'm wondering, this product has been on the market for how long now? Over a year, right? A year and a half? Has it been a year? Over a year and a half. Wow. And only now are people really at the highest levels starting to look at this in a critical way. Like I know that Denmark has stopped the vaccine, I believe, for everybody under 50, unless they have, I think, some specific vulnerabilities. Is that right? That is what I've heard, yes. Yeah. And people are now starting to talk about it in a significant way, and even connecting it with excess death numbers that people are having trouble figuring out. But what do you make of how this whole thing has rolled out? I will say it, I'm unvaccinated, and I am, because I was a science journalist and I was worried about how short the clinical trials were. I didn't trust it. And I've also done pharmaceutical products liability stories as an investigative journalist, and I know that things can go terribly wrong. So, and I looked at my risk benefit ratio, but I know that many other people who just believed this, the safe and effective conversation that their doctors were having must now be feeling really upset that it's taken so long to really start having serious conversations about the risks of this vaccination. Yeah, well, from the beginning, the term safe is just not, it's not a term that we use in medicine. To say something is safe there's no medical intervention that's safe. Everything has has potential side effects. We can say that, from what we understand right now, our benefits are, greatly outweighing the harms. That's kind of would only be the responsible way of saying it. And to say safe and effective continuously to this day, when we know of this myocarditis risk, which is clearly a risk, then it's weird terminology to use. And so that is, in the first place, just was a wrong. I don't think it was right to use that terminology, especially as a physician speaking to a patient.
I wonder where that came from. I suspect that maybe the public health units that were trying these nudge units, there was one in the UK, and I know they had one in the States and one here too, who were using these kind of behavioral science phrases and tricks to get people to be compliant. Maybe they weighed in on that. I don't know. I remember when I first heard it, I thought, it's safer than what and effective at what? What does that even mean? And why are smart, well-trained medical people using that phrase? It seemed more like a PR campaign than a description of a vaccine.
Yeah, I would agree. I can't think of any other medication or medical intervention where we are going out saying it's safe.
So what do you believe the future of the vaccine should be now, given what you found? Obviously, people will be wanting more evidence still, I suspect. But what is your view about what the future of the vaccine should be?
This is my own opinion, because I'm sure that, of my other co-authors, their opinions could differ. Yeah. But I would personally like for there to, I think what Denmark's doing is wise, stopping it at age under 50. I think that's definitely a wise place to start. I think that any sort of booster coming forward should be done with large scale studies of human randomized controlled trials to determine if this is an issue, if this issue is real. And I don't think that we're going to find, there is some actual FDA surveillance data that we've recently come into, actually after we published our study, that we're working with some other people, which essentially actually finds 5 of our adverse events at increased rates at about the same rate that we're seeing. It's in that same range of about 50%, give or take, increase in the rate of these adverse events. And when the FDA's current position on it, they never publicly released the study. Actually, we found it in a protocol for an additional study that they're doing to look into it further. Right. But they found it with the original full vaccination, and then they found it again in the booster campaign. The same adverse events. These were myocardial infarction, which is a heart attack, pulmonary embolism, which is a blood clot, and then these two various bleeding disorders. And so these were kind of along the lines with our kind of coagulation disorder picture. So when the FDA is seeing that they have these adverse events in their surveillance data, and then we have our study, which is coming out, which is independently finding them, unaware of their observational data, so further supporting what they found, I think that they should have taken a pause. And this was a moment to, okay, we're releasing this new Omicron booster. Let's do a massive trial right now. Let's do a massive trial comparing the vaccines. I have no understanding why we're not doing these studies to further understand these vaccines if we're going to just keep giving them to people.
Not just giving them to people, forcing people. I'm up in Canada, as you well know, and our Prime Minister is absolutely addicted to making sure the entire country is vaccinated. And if they choose not to be, we pay a very, very high price up here. I didn't even get to go to my son's graduation from university because they wouldn't let me get on a plane. So, the fact that and I obviously, as I said, I was concerned about bad outcomes. So those of us who were appropriately skeptical at the beginning paid a really high price for feeling that way.
There's a lot that went wrong here with these trials. Yeah. And they when the FDA first was talking about when they approve them, they were saying that what they were going to do was they were going to continue the trials for a period of time. after authorization, which they didn't do. But even that, even if they were going to argue that it's unethical, they at least could have waited for the people in their region to say, hey, let us know when you become eligible for the vaccine in your community. But they just gave the vaccine to everyone very quickly instead of they could have. That's unethical that took a vaccine away from, the elderly person who maybe needed it more than they did. So where the ethical decision to unblind the entire study at the same time, I don't understand that, especially when they were saying they were going to do otherwise, and why they haven't enforced the additional studies to compare the vaccines to the next. In general, when a new drug is released and there's already a drug on the market, you have to compare it to the existing one. We don't just, and I don't think that they should have been compared without placebo. I think that they did definitely need a placebo study, but they also should have been shown to be at least as good as the one that they had originally authorized. Yeah. Or at least promised to get those studies into them. Because I understand that there was, this time that they were concerned every minute that we're not vaccinating is going to be people dying. So they, at the same time, they could have been having comparison trials during that time period. It's undefendable to not have done those.
This whole thing just seems so botched to me. And sadly, this is where also conspiracy theories come from, because standing back from the mess of COVID-19 public policy, and I include lockdowns and, and this mass vaccination campaign for people who didn't even really need it. It's just mind-boggling how so many people could be so wrong and who still kind of double down on that wrongness. I was hoping there would be some major mea culpa on behalf of people in public health who got it wrong, but they just keep doubling down. It doesn't really make any sense to me, but I don't know. Maybe if good people like you keep going, eventually they're going to have to confront it.
Yeah, I think that with the kind of spreading of conspiracy theory, it in some respect, even to go back to the problem of fact checking, that what it did in a sort of a strange way is all of the people who would have normally kind of maybe have been contrarian voices in this crowd were very quiet, and it allowed for a lot of kind of random people to rise, who maybe aren't and power to them for trying to solve a problem of where the academics and the public intellectuals weren't speaking up appropriately. But what that led to is a large group of people who don't have necessarily the training in epidemiology and such, and they're trying to learn it as quickly as they can, but they don't have that, and they don't have a mentor who's kind of been correcting them along the way. So sometimes they're probably making some mistakes while they're trying to figure out what's going on. But we wouldn't have had this problem if the contrarian voices who initially who probably would have been the ones speaking out on this in the first place, if they were the ones kind of leading this charge, and if they were the ones who were just speaking with the media, and these different ideas could have been playing out much more in the mainstream rather than over Substack, and where it seems the only place where these ideas can even reach daylight.
It's wild, isn't it? Substack is, I keep saying, it's like it's what the New Yorker used to be back in the day when it was not so corrupted by groupthink. Substack has become really important.
It has, but the fact that it's completely unedited articles, sometimes they're going to get things wrong, and that's to be they'll get it wrong more so than a newspaper with editors double checking everything and being able to go to experts and have them double checking everything. But the problem is that when your experts are only allowed to speak in one direction, it's not going to work. And the whole newspaper system doesn't work anymore by only asking experts, because those experts can only give you one opinion.
Yeah. Well, and you know what? It's also like, I think people have to come to some idea collectively that, as you just said, the experts were wrong this time. And I think what happens is when people have trouble believing that, then they go to some of the more nutty kind of conspiracy theories around this, right? But
what I'm trying to say, I don't think necessarily that we know that the experts were wrong. We know that the experts who were allowed to speak, who were speaking, ended up being wrong on a lot of issues.
Good.
On a lot of issues that should have been debated and probably would have been debated if the culture and like the fact checking environment of being labeled as a misinformation spreader wasn't so prevalent. So many issues that I think where we're saying, oh, experts got it wrong, and there was an appearance of consensus. I'm not certain that there was a true consensus of expert opinion. Just the consensus was just in the ones who were speaking out loud.
Yeah, it appeared to be a consensus because they were allowed to speak. The people like the Great Barrington Declaration, for instance, were not allowed to speak and were smeared before they even really hit the ground running. So you're absolutely right about that. I think it's true. Yes,
from the top. From the top.
Yeah, from the top. I've seen the emails right there. I think, who was it? I think Francis Collins got the ball rolling.
Francis Collins and Anthony Fauci. I might get the wording wrong, but I think he said, we'll take them out. Take them out or something like that, which is pretty extreme. It reminds me of in residency, we had a former military, like a special forces Army Ranger who was in our residency, and someone was talking about domestic violence, and he says to them, and she was saying how we need to speak out and stop this domestic violence, and he was like, actually, I've run into a lot of problems at a football game. I saw a guy getting physical with his wife, and then I stepped in to stop it, and then she started hitting me with her shoe. And, the whole thing went, he's like, it's these situations aren't so easy the way that you're saying it. And she's like, no, I'm not saying that, if you see it, you should just take the guy out. And he's like, whoa. I didn't take him out. That's a totally different thing. I think it's just a military term versus a, common language term.
But I know, but those emails, they just expose so much. I mean, they also said, as I remember, that they wanted to let the virus rip. That was the phrase. And also that they were fringe. I mean, imagine these three august people as fringe. It was just remarkable, and said everything. I mean, I don't know why people aren't fired over these things. We live in an age where nobody's accountable anymore for anything. To me, those emails were a firing offense for Fauci. And I think Collins had already maybe retired by then, but it's just shocking. And then the media ran with it. They did it.
Yes, and we're essentially now coming to terms where we're approaching essentially what the Great Barrington Declaration suggested. We're more or less moving towards almost all their recommendations, but at the same time somehow claiming everything we did before was necessary, and now it's really not logical. But yet society has moved much more towards accepting kind of at least the principles what Great Barrington was pushing, but not coming out and saying it.
See, this is a problem for me. And one of the reasons I'm so fond of you is because the first time we talked was because you'd apologized to Jay Bhattacharya because you disagreed so vehemently over the Great Barrington Declaration. And then, like all good critically thinking people do, you realized you were wrong and you apologized for it, which is something we need more of these days. But what bugs me, so I admire that very, very much on many levels, human and spiritual and for science and everything else. But what bugs me about what you just said is the idea that none of the people responsible for some of this stuff are being held to account. And we do seem to be slowly moving on from the lockdown school closure paradigm and all of the terror that it wrought, including in my own family, to something more resembling that. But nobody's saying, whoops, we were wrong. They're just kind of massaging it forward and hoping we won't notice. It's like the Iraq War, oh, no, we didn't find any weapons of mass destruction, but, whatever. It's just, yeah.
But everyone sort of almost has that innately within them, not everyone who was, some people I'm sure who were with Great Barrington from the very beginning and agreed with them, but even of the population who did not, and I mean more general public, we could see just in regular everyday conversations that when people talk about COVID and what was going on, they're like, oh, it was back then, when we were taking it really seriously. Yeah. And, it's just the way that people talk about it just informally is almost in an acknowledgement of that the way we were acting at this time is not the same as we are acting now. Yeah. And people talk about that openly when they bring up a story from a certain time period.
But you said something really interesting to me, and it did explain a lot. And I love this. You said, I was an ER physician seeing the devastating results of the virus on the people who were susceptible to having a bad outcome, and that framed your worldview. And in a sense, you said that made you almost disqualified from making policy decisions about it, because the view that you had was so specifically focused on one piece of it that you actually couldn't see the big picture, which I thought was terribly smart, because we have in Canada, a lot of the people pushing lockdowns and school closures were ER docs, and who I started calling the terror docs, because they still appear. They still want to lock down and close schools, even to this day. But I thought it was really important that you say that, because you were well-meaning, right? But just not seeing the whole picture, which is where the epidemiologists come in.
Yeah, it was at the time. It was trying to prevent. I was seeing a large amount of people dying in my hospitals, and here was a plan that was being promoted at the time as it seemed reasonable that it should work, that it should reduce it. I really thought that we were going to actually see it was going to become very obvious, like the states that weren't following the rules, that weren't following these kind of COVID policies, were going to just get devastated. The countries that weren't following it were going to get devastated. And that didn't happen. It didn't happen at all. There's no real, I don't see any apparent real difference between the countries that were following rules and didn't, based on just that. So it became apparent that these rules weren't, if they were working, they're not working well enough that we can that it became obvious, as I had would have predicted, and what as you in science, the whole purpose of a hypothesis is you make predictions with it, and you see, do these things happen? And when they don't, then you have to understand why. And if you can't understand it, you're basically falsifying your hypothesis that these interventions, when they were put into place, we're not seeing a clear reduction. I actually still am a little confused at even how they didn't really work at all, or how they look to have not worked at all. It's confusing to me, because they seem like they should have worked a little bit. We should have. I would have expected locking everyone up in their homes to have ended up, but it didn't work out. And I'm sure there's a reason why they didn't work. But
that should be your next study. Why don't you do that?
Yeah,
No, I'm interested in that too, because that's a logical thing you're suggesting. And some people have said it's because when they realized it was aerosolized, they should have stopped that idea, because I think there really is a ventilation issue with it. Smart people have said that to me, that if you're locked up in your apartment, it can still be carried through the building. I guess like Legionnaire's disease was, or something. I'm not sure, but it would be good to know the mechanism of the spread in such a way that would explain why the lockdowns didn't actually work at all, as you say.
Yeah, there's different hypotheses that I've heard, but I don't think that we have a clear answer. You could say people were breaking it, but at the same time, even if some people were breaking the various rules, it still should have. If you had, there were points in time where there was pretty widespread acceptance, and widespread people were following the rules, even if it's not 100%, then why that didn't reduce the numbers of future of the hospitalizations, and how that happened. Maybe it's, we know that most COVID-19 transmissions occur within a household. And so then there's basically these occasional ones that go between households. Then most are from family member to family member. So maybe the idea of putting people at home is not the best idea if that's where most transmissions happen. If they're occasionally leaving, who knows? I think that in the end, it's actually not as important to figure out. It would be nice to know so that we can maybe, if there's anything in the future, we could do a better job. But the fact that they didn't work was enough to say, let's stop doing these, because they're obviously harming people. They're obviously harmful. And so when you take in the fact that there's no clear benefit and that there's obvious harm, then the answer of what we were doing there to like what should be our next step was pretty clear. I thought Omicron was actually going to be the perfect place to like walk everything back and start saying that like, oh, okay, now people could have walked away kind of like, without admitting wrong even with Omicron and saying, okay, now we have this new virus. It's not as bad. Everyone, let's just come on. We don't need to have anything. You don't need to be scared of this virus anymore. And that would have been appropriate. I have only seen in the last 6 months since even longer, maybe now, since February, I have only admitted one person with COVID-19 to the hospital. And, it was a very sick person with a terminal neurological disease on hospice care, essentially, who, she was incredibly fragile. And so if I would, before that, when I was seeing COVID during the heydays of those waves, I was seeing 2 or 3 people dying each shift. And now we're talking months without a hospitalization for COVID-19. I've hospitalized a lot of people with COVID-19. And I believe that what happened here that's a problem is that in the initial days when people were saying, oh, people aren't getting, all these COVID hospitalizations and death, they're just people with COVID, not they're car accidents and they also have COVID and then they die. And in reality, that is not at all what I was seeing. Almost everyone I saw who was dying those days was clearly COVID-19. But then that really changed. It really changed with Omicron. Before Omicron, every day I'd go into work, I'd look at my phone, say, oh, look, hospital cases are rising. Walk in, it was like weather. Hospital cases were rising. Walk in, oh, hospitalizations are rising. Yep, hospitalizations are rising. Deaths are rising. Yep, deaths are rising. It was just like weather when you go outside, if you look at your phone right before you go outside. But then with Omicron, infections rising. Yep. Then they said hospitalizations are rising. I was like, no, they're not seeing that. Deaths are rising. Nope, not seeing that. And so our data became unreliable, I think, with Omicron. And I'm not saying that no one's dying from Omicron. I'm sure that people are, but it's totally not on the same level of what it was. It's not on a level that would make me that we should really, it shouldn't be a concerning problem in the sense that they're just not, it's not, at least from my anecdotal experience. I can't say, my anecdotal experience could be wrong, but it's so different from what it was that it doesn't feel like a thing that we should be afraid of.
It's very interesting that you say that, because here, a lot of the doctors who go on TV who were absolutely political, there's no question about where they come from, and you can tell from their Twitter accounts. But they were saying that with Omicron, oh, people are dying all over the place, and we're really super busy, and we've got a lockdown again to preserve the hospitals. I mean, it was ludicrous, and it feels like I know that here there was a big, and continues to be, as I understand it, a big problem of identifying COVID deaths as from COVID when the person was actually dying of something else. And I wonder if that's what was going on, because we had waves of Omicron deaths here that were being front paged and didn't make sense, because what was happening here didn't jive with what was happening in other places, to the point where I tweeted out once, how come everybody in Ontario, or how come in Ontario Omicron patients are doing so badly? In other places, they're doing much better. What's going on here? And it was kind of it was a rhetorical tweet. But based on what you're saying, that just kind of confirms what I feared, that there was something else going on with the numbers.
I also can't comment on what, was happening specifically in Ontario. Like I said, this is my anecdotal experience.
Yeah.
And, what could have been happening in a different region could have been totally different. I know during the early days of COVID, when I was having these waves that I was talking about, where we were seeing large amounts of death that concerned me, I know, like, when I was speaking with my friends in different hospitals in different regions, they were seeing nothing at that time.
Really?
So, but at the same time, I know I'm seeing a lot of COVID-19 infections. So they were just not seeing many COVID-19 infections. It just was, in the early days where waves were happening at different time periods.
Yeah. Well, I'm reading kind of credible stuff that was probably out in the world. The virus itself was probably out in the world much sooner too than we even know, that maybe like a year before it was kind of out there. So who knows how many people were infected when before, because the testing was you'll recall, it was kind of a shambles at the beginning. And lots of people were asymptomatic too, I'm assuming. So who knows actually epidemiologically what was even happening then? It's hard to know that. And that also obviously affects the way we discover how it was spread too.
I could say that some people have asked me before is if COVID-19 was never realized, if we never named it, if we never had a test for it, would we have noticed it happening in the hospitals? And the answer is absolutely yes. It would have been very obvious that we're seeing a large number of deaths during a very short period of time. This is, a 1 month, 2 month period during each surge, the number of deaths that were dying of similar syndromes would have been very obvious. I don't think it would have been possible to not know something was going on, even without the test. We may have just said, "Oh, there's a bad viral pneumonia sweeping through."
That's killing our old people.
Yeah,
right? That's killing our old people. Yeah,
which is true. Which was still true. I mean, that's what this was. This was a bad viral pneumonia that was killing a lot more people than a typical viral pneumonia does.
Yeah. That's interesting. And I did read a study the other day. We talked about this last time, where apparently the ventilators were responsible for a much higher death toll than we knew even too. There was a fresh study out about that. So I wonder, I would love to see a study that really teased out the death numbers based on who was ventilated and when, and how that impacted the deaths. More generally too, because that also means if the vents that were used quite prolifically at the beginning were also contributing to the deaths, then we can't actually know then from the deaths how many were actually purely just COVID, can we?
Well, ventilators don't typically kill people. So it was definitely a conjunction of people. If you're getting intubated, there was a reason why they were intubating you. And so they were intubating people maybe earlier than they should have been. And that is now thought of as is detrimental in the care of it. But I still would count those as COVID-19 deaths, because it was while we were trying. Now it's just our medical approach to it's just improved. It's not, so it's the approach then was worse, and the interventions led to some harm. But I think that's what we'd expect with a novel virus, is doctors trying to figure out how to treat it best. It's at the time we were unleashing, people were putting them on all sorts of different drugs at the time, and we're figuring out which ones were good and which ones weren't, but we were constantly just every shift or so it was a different combination of drugs were being used and when someone should be intubated. It's hard to fault given the novelty of the situation. I know early on I was actually very against this early intubation strategy personally, but I can't say that it was more just that was what I was seeing personally from patients who were intubated early. It seemed to me that they were anecdotally that it was the outcomes were not going as well as people who were intubation was being delayed. And that you were able to avoid intubation in a large number of these patients that you typically wouldn't avoid it because, and the reality at that time also is, if you were looking at the Chinese literature that was coming out with, they were saying you're going to have the desire to intubate these patients when you see their oxygen saturations immediately, and we recommend that you don't. because we're finding worse outcomes with that. So this was already being discussed in the Chinese literature, and while we were trying to figure it out.
No. Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not laying any blame here at all. I mean, I think it must have been horrific trying to figure out as you go in these wards full of people who were clearly dying with something that people didn't understand very well. Let's talk about the spike protein again as we kind of wrap up. But what is it about the spike protein in both the virus itself and the vaccine that makes it responsible for the kinds of physiological events we're seeing? What does it do?
Well, I'm not exactly a biochemist, and I feel like this would be a little bit outside of my field, but essentially it attaches to something called this ACE receptor, and the ACE2 receptor, and wherever this binding happens, it seems to essentially cause problems wherever it's binding. So a lot of the bindings are in blood vessels, but you have binding in the intestines as well. And so the problems that we're seeing, when your problem is in the blood vessels, then you're connected to everything, right? So you end up with these problems kind of everywhere. And so that's where these the ACE2 problem is associated with, where our body just has a lot of these ACE2 receptors.
Yeah. So it can cause a multitude of problems is the point, which COVID does too, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
I actually saw an interesting piece the other day suggesting that people with long COVID get more people who are emotionally in trouble when they get infected, get long COVID. And I don't think that they were necessarily suggesting that long COVID is a psychiatric issue, although I'm sure in some people it is, given how frightened everybody is these days. But that there's something about physiologically about being having anxiety that makes you more vulnerable to this outcome, which I thought was quite interesting, actually. And of course, it's been politicized too, because they'll say, well, kids don't need to be vaccinated because they don't get sick from COVID, but they might get long COVID. That seems to be how long COVID has moved into the discussion now. So obviously I'm suspicious of it, but I just, because I had COVID and I had something that lasted a little bit longer. And I was sort of calling it that. It's completely gone now. I don't know what it is. I just was sick longer, I think, than most people were. But it's politicized. The people who want to vaccinate the whole world and the whole world's dogs and cats are using long COVID as the way to convince people to do it, which I think is ridiculous.
And I'm uncertain of any solid, like, there's definitely no randomized controlled trial data that's showing that the vaccines reduce long COVID. So it's something that's pretty, even if long COVID is a thing, then there's the next step of, does the vaccine reduce it? And now we're in the game of where we say, oh, long COVID, you can catch long COVID from a mild case of COVID, and there's this idea of like, oh, if you catch COVID and you have the vaccine, then you're going to have mild COVID, which you've just said also leads to long COVID. So then how are we then jumping to that it's preventing long COVID? It's really, I mean, even logically, it's hard for me to put together. So you would need some pretty solid studies showing you're getting reductions in long COVID before you're claiming that's the reason to vaccinate people, when there's potentially also, there's actual harms that are now appear that appear to be more likely than we had originally anticipated. Yeah.
So I understand your next paper, I don't know if your next one, but you're working on a future paper anyway, that is going to be about the fact-checking phenomenon that has bedeviled all truth-seeking people. So why are you doing that?
Well, I'm not certain that we're going to be putting together the article on fact checking ourselves or not, but we're working with different groups of people who we think may be best to tackle that question. But we're now in a situation where our paper has been fact checked by some random fact checking site that leads to it. For example, it can't be posted on Facebook, the preprint. And our published paper, our peer-reviewed paper, which was peer-reviewed by experts in vaccinology, made it through an editor's decision of prominent journal.
Yeah.
Without really any major changes from the preprint. We've updated some of the limitations in our discussion section, but we really the study is the same. And so we now have a situation where our peer-reviewed article that essentially confirms at least that this is not misinformation. This is a scientific study that warranted a publication in a prominent journal that was peer reviewed, is being fact checked by a group of people who really they are using one or two people's opinion, and one of them is off of a YouTube video. And so this is really not acceptable to have our preprint labeled as misinformation when it's gone through the proper channels of science. And I think that if you want to challenge this article now, please, we encourage people to repeat our study, do it over again. We want them. We asked the FDA to repeat the study. We asked, we're asking because they have access also to the individual data, which would be great. But we encourage anyone who's, questioning our study or wants to see if they would find the same results. We think that you should. And there's one other piece of this all, right? When we listed out our serious adverse events, the first thing we did was created a table that listed every single serious adverse event in the Pfizer and the Moderna trials. We found that in the Pfizer trial, even without our, using the Brighton collaboration, without the adverse event list of special interest, in the original Pfizer trial, there were more adverse events in the vaccine group. There was 36% higher rate of adverse events total. And the FDA at the time of authorization reported that these two groups were balanced between groups. And that's false. There was more serious adverse events in the vaccine group. And the reason the FDA didn't find this is because they measured the number of participants. And our study used a slightly different way to analyze this, which isn't a better way. It's just a slightly different way. And it counted the number of events. And this is something that they were, one of the pieces that the FDA said, oh, we don't count adverse events. We count participants. We were like, well, doesn't really matter if you don't count them. They're actually higher. And you guys missed this. And the reason why they don't think it's important is because one person can experience multiple adverse events. And so the problem with that is, for example, you can have a heart attack and then that could lead to heart failure. Then your fluid could enter into your lungs and you'll have, go into respiratory failure. You'll have too much trouble breathing. Now, that's versus you just had a heart attack. Okay. So if you have multiple events, that's worse than having one event. Now, so the vaccine could make it more likely that if you have an event, it makes that event worse for you. Mm-hmm. It's also possible that the vaccine could make you if you're susceptible to these adverse events, then you're acceptable to the other one. So you could have a heart attack after dose 1, and then for dose 2, they're like, oh, don't worry, heart attacks aren't associated with the vaccine, go on. And then you go to take dose 2 and you have a stroke. That would also count as 2 multiple events, but in the same person. So that would only count as 1 event. Mm-hmm. And so there's no reason why the vaccine group should have more events in it. And so the only difference between the groups, the vaccine group and the placebo group, is one group got the vaccine and one group got the placebo. So the reason for randomized controlled trials is to basically create these perfect groups, these groups that if you find a difference, the only thing that's different between them is the intervention. So why the vaccine is causing more adverse events is most likely the vaccine. That's just how you interpret randomized controlled trials. So this idea of this being an inappropriate way to measure it it's something that is totally, it seems to me as a false information, just because it's not the way that it's typically done. It's not the way that it's usually done. And I would imagine in most trials, if you have more events, you're also going to have more participants. And I would imagine it's likely that if we increase the trial size we would find it with more participants. We'd find it with more participants. It's just that it was on the edge of finding it. There was a 20% increase in the number of participants, and the vaccine group was also twice as likely to experience multiple events.
Wow.
So,
did you tease out a number like, given how many vaccines have been administered in America, where you're getting your data from, how many people then have been vaccine injured by the vaccines?
We did not, because we're not certain. We did not do that. It's because, like I said before, we need more data to be able to be certain that these adverse events are happening in which groups at what frequency.
Right. But okay, am I pushing you too far to say, are you ballparking? I'm just trying to get a handle on how big the problem is.
It's hard to say, because also we have boosters that have been going.
Yeah.
And so I don't know, and I don't know what the harm, an estimate on the harm of the boosters, because our trial didn't have that. It could be less, it could be more.
Yeah.
So and also it could be very different in people who've had natural immunity. Oh, that's one other piece actually that also offsets the harm benefit analysis.
Yes.
In that, and so how much harm and is it possible that there's more harm in people who've had the vaccine before? I don't know. It's possible. It's possible that there's less. So there's too many uncertainties to offer a real number. If you wanted, you could just take the 1 in 800 and multiply it by the 200 something million people who've taken the vaccine.
Yeah.
I don't that would give you a ballpark, but I don't know if it would be. I don't know exactly how accurate it would be.
Yeah. And it's one of those things where, doctors are throwing this term around like, oh, hybrid immunity. If you have natural immunity and you get the vaccine, it's just better. Like, it's just, and it doesn't really seem like a very scientific interpretation of that. Do we know about that? Or?
Well, again, they're using observational data to create this, and it's not, you will not it won't happen. It won't lead to reliable results without randomized trial data on something like this, a question like this, where very different types of people get the vaccine. And so using observational data to rely on, it's useful to think about what you should study, but we've been gotten observational data has led us astray so many times in clinical medicine. And so that's why we need the randomized trials to demonstrate that, to demonstrate these issues, to tease them apart. For hormone replacement therapy used to be widely popular, based on observational data, is that it reduced heart attacks, it reduced breast cancer, and then when they did the randomized trial, it turned out actually, no, it increases heart attacks, it increases breast cancer. So this is a common. Anyone who's been practicing clinical medicine for some time knows that we consistently get observational data consistently leads us astray and leads us down the wrong path, that once we do the randomized trial to figure these things out, it teases that apart.
Yeah. Well, you know what, I have to say, I'm quite frightened, because the story about the vaccines is only getting worse. It's not getting better. The more we know, the scarier it is. And I respect you for not wanting to extrapolate a large number. But rationally, I fear it is a big number. And I fear that the adverse events, like some of these heart attacks in people, especially in young men, are not being attributed when they should be attributed. And that makes me very, very nervous. I don't like the period we're living in right now. I feel like I cannot rely on the science bureaucracy to actually protect the health of myself and my family right now. There's too many agendas at play, and that's very, very scary for me.
Also, it would be good to figure these kind of things out.
Wouldn't it?
Also allow us to, for people who've taken the vaccine and combined with various different risk factors they may have that make them at a higher likelihood of experiencing an adverse event. If we need to know this more, because there's a possibility that we need to put them onto preventative therapy, and we need to figure out what we can do to best help these people. It might be there might be interventions. We don't know because we're still so early in figuring this out. But the fact that it's, it becomes such a difficult environment to even get a paper published on this, and let alone start talking about how do we deal with it? Is there anything that we can do to limit this harm? We're a good distance away from that.
Well, and the other point I just want to make, and I'm sure you'll agree, is the idea that with these fact checkers that then compel the censorship of this type of study on media, and they've been doing all kinds of stuff like this since the beginning. Anybody who was not towing the party line got censored, including the Great Barrington people. They're responsible, in my view, for deaths now because they did not permit, the way they went about this did not permit the scientific debate we needed to prevent some of these tragedies. And you and I think, both can agree on that. There are tragedies now connected to this vaccine. There's no question. We don't know how many, but there are. And it would have been way better if we could have been having this discussion, well, before the vaccines were even granted the emergency use. I mean, it should have been. But the censorship around this is just tragic. It's really, I think the people who've been part of this have to take a long, hard look at their own moral compass and what they've done here.
Well, historically, I don't think that there's many events that we can find where as a the general public is like, oh, censorship. That was a really good idea. Thank God we did a lot of censorship then. That's typically not looked kindly upon, after the event, even though during the event it maybe seemed appropriate. But historically speaking, it doesn't age well.
No, it sure doesn't. And I think history will, as you say, will not be kind about what's happened here. We need to have a bigger discussion, and we need the people who were responsible for making these decisions to be held to account. And you guys in science and medicine need to be able to speak honestly about what you're finding without fear of being punished in some way. So I hope we're getting there. I'm going to be appearing at a censorship in medicine conference in October that's going to be talking about a lot of this stuff. I think it's terribly, terribly important.
Oh, where is that happening?
It's happening in Nova Scotia, in Bedeque. And I believe that Jay Bhattacharya is coming up, and some other people who were, like, I remember when Jay Bhattacharya, I think his Twitter account was pulled down more than once.
Yeah.
And his YouTube videos too. I believe that there was a meeting with Ron DeSantis amongst the Great Barrington people that went up on YouTube, and YouTube pulled it down, and they were right about everything. So we gotta stop this. Look, I think you're terribly smart, and I also think you're really brave. And as I said earlier, I love the fact that you apologize and admit when you're wrong. That's been sadly lacking during the last 2.5 years. So thank you very much. And thanks for coming on the show.
Of course, my pleasure, Trish.
Okay, thank you. I'll talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
So that was Dr. Joseph Freeman. He's somebody I hope, as the years go by and you ponder COVID-19, you'll think of fondly the way we think of Jay Bhattacharya and Martin Kulldorff and Sunetra Gupta and Marty McCary and Scott Atlas and all the brave and bold, and my friend Ann Bauer, the writer, all the brave and bold people who were early disruptors of what was going on in the national mindset and in the legislatures in Western countries virtually around the world except Sweden, which I heard from somebody that the reason Sweden didn't lock down was because they didn't think the citizens would approve of it. Isn't that a bizarre idea? It's just like, what kind of government actually does what the citizens want? Not here. We're all bowing to Klaus Schwab. But anyway, so do remember Joseph. He's gotten less attention, but I think he should probably get more just for courage. And also, sometimes in a time of lies, telling truth can be an incredibly important thing and a dangerous thing too. I'm sure there's lots of people who don't like Joseph Freeman because he seems incapable of not telling the truth. So think about him when you're down. There are good people out there still. So also thinking of good people, let's move to The women are burning their hijabs and they want the Iranian regime to fall. So do I. Let's just read. There's a great piece in Barry Weiss, who's knocking it out of the park. She has a Substack called Common Sense, if you don't already know that. And it's written by Ruel Marc Gerecht. By now you have the indelible images from the streets of dozens of cities and towns across the Islamic Republic of Iran. They have found a way out despite the fact that the regime has been routinely cutting off the internet. Videos of mothers screaming, "Damn you, Khomeini," photographs of women burning their hijabs and dancing around bonfires. A young woman cutting her hair in public while crowds chant, "Death to the dictator." Wow. So we have a clip of her doing that. It's brilliant. The person who posted it on Twitter said, see, this is where Twitter is great, right? This is why I can't quit Twitter, because of this kind of stuff. Unprecedented scenes in Iran. Woman sits on top of utility box and cuts her hair in main square in Kerman to protest the death of Mahsa Amini. After her arrest by the morality police, they killed this girl. They may have tortured her. Ugh. You know, women are not allowed to be free in Iran. That's the simplest way to put it. And the men there hate them. You know, these mullahs, they hate them. People clap their hands and chant, "Death to the dictator." So I'm just going to play a little bit of that. It sounds kind of scary because it's a revolution, but it's also joyous. So listen to this. So I will say to you, you know, Florida's just had a terrible hurricane. We're finding the truth out about how they lied to us about vaccines and forced us to take them against our will, even though they were dangerous. They are dangerous and they don't stop transmission. That's a bad thing. So there's a lot of bad things happening in the world, but what's happening in Iran right now is totally brilliant. Hold these people also in your thoughts as you go about your business. Let me just carry on because, of course, under every silver lining, there is Joe Biden standing by to screw it up, right? You know, it's all very much of a challenge to the wokesters and to my intersectional feminist sisters who are so busy not wanting to appear Islamophobic that they haven't supported this movement for years when they've been begging for it. They were literally, they got virtually no help from North American women. There are some, obviously, but not the mainstream feminists operating today, the young women operating today, because they didn't want to hurt anybody's feelings. It's like the same feminists who supported the women in Iran are the ones who want to stop young children being dragged through the trans extremist ideology that leads to breast amputation and worse. You know, I mean, that's so there's a real generational divide on this, I'm telling you. And it makes me sort of mad. Intersectionality is a bad thing. So let me finish. As happened in every major demonstration since the pro-democracy Green movement was crushed in 2009, many are speaking openly of revolution. The current demonstrations, which began on September 16th, were sparked, as so much else in Iran, by a woman. The Islamic Republic's ruling clerics, echoing renowned Muslim theologians from a millennium before, are obsessed with the convulsive power of female sexuality. In this case, with the dark brown hair of Mahsa Amini, a 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian woman not known for provocative political behavior. She died in Tehran after being beaten to death by Iran's morality police for the crime of having too much hair showing beneath her mandatory headscarf. Despite the regime's totalitarian efforts to restrict cultural expression and personal liberties, Westernization, even in the most closed quarters of the country, has been unstoppable. The Franco-Iranian scholar Farhad Karskohavar published a revealing inquiry in 2009 into the daughters of senior clerics in the holy city of Qum, the spiritual and educational center of theocracy. To be 20 in the land of the Ayatollahs, it was called, and it showed that even the most conservative daughters of the revolution have profoundly Occidental sentiments and aspirations. So it's not at all surprising to see demonstrations for Amini in Qum right now. In Qum and across the country, young Iranians are raging against religious tyranny. They want the Islamic Republic to fall. They want liberty. Repeatedly and in great numbers, they have shown they want democracy. Here's the kicker. So it is a strange thing that the United States, the West's engine of liberty and democracy, is so ardently seeking a nuclear deal that will enrich the men who are literally beating these women to death. That's what they're doing. They're not speaking up. They want that deal, that Obama deal that was a nightmare. No sensible or serious person who understands the dynamic in Iran wanted that deal to go through. And here they are. The country is finally having the revolution that America should be fully supporting, and they're negotiating with the mullahs who are killing women. Get it? This is bad. Really bad. And finally today, I could not let what was clearly sabotage of the Nord Stream pipeline go without comment. And we are going to be doing a show on it next week, a really special show with a very, very, very special guest who I am proud to be interviewing on Monday from overseas. That's all I'm going to say right now. The smart people in the world, people like Eugippius and others, other big foreign policy experts who tell the truth, are saying that the pipeline was blown up deliberately by the United States. If I was going to bet on it, I would bet that that was true for a whole bunch of reasons. They want to escalate this thing into, it looks like they actually want to go to war with Russia. They're certainly trying to depose Putin. That is their end game. It's not getting to peace in the Ukraine, where people are dying for nothing. Russia is still, they're going to win. I know they've had allegedly a couple of losses over there, but I think it's highly unlikely that the Ukraine is going to beat Russia or that Russia would allow that to happen. Talks between the two that we're doing well. This was reported by Agence France Presse, I believe in April, because I reported it on the show. I was like, wow, why isn't anybody talking about this? Apparently Biden stopped it. He stopped the negotiations. He didn't want a peace deal. So they stopped the talks. Now we've got nukes being threatened. Zelensky wants nukes fired, apparently, and Putin's threatening. This is absolute madness. So how does the Nord Stream play into this? This creates, if they can blame it on Russia, which they're trying to do, what they call a casus belli for escalating the war even further. These people are nincompoops. There are no serious people left in the world right now. There just aren't. There are serious people. They're all on podcasts. They should be, the podcasters should be governing, in my view, because is anybody in the Biden administration actually a serious, Tony Blinken, really? These are very, very dangerous times we live in, and this is barely being covered. And when it is being covered, it's being covered through propaganda on legacy media. So look out. I just want to say a couple things. There was a tweet. Here's a little bit of evidence for us. 5:40 a.m. on September 28th, 2022, Radek Sikorski, who was a member of the European Parliament with a blue check mark, tweeted out, with a photograph of the bubbling ocean above the ruptured pipeline. Thank you, USA. They're not even trying to hide it, right? Russia, of course, accuses America of attacking the Nord Stream. They'll just say that, it's propaganda on Putin's part. But there is this old clip that was unearthed. I first saw it on Tucker Carlson of Biden saying, yes, we'll stop. This was in February 7th of 2022. Biden threatened to end Nord Stream. He didn't say blow it up, but he was very kind of oblique and said, we can end Nord Stream. So he's on tape saying that. And this is what I want to leave you with. Weapons of mass destruction, Gulf of Tonkin, which was a fake operation, started the Vietnam War, and the Kuwaiti incubator stories, also a false flag. A false flag drummed up by the Kuwaiti ambassador, whose own daughter pretended to be a nurse in a Kuwaiti hospital, claiming that Iraqi soldiers were unplugging the incubators in order to gin up support for an attack on Iraq. They got found out. The Fifth Estate, actually, where I used to work, I think it was with Harper's Magazine, did a co-investigation and proved that. It's true. So this happens. This is how America rolls. They have a big old lie. The propagandists and the legacy media push it out, like WMD. That was a total lie. They push it out, and then they get what they want. So, and also the timing is interesting too, because, it was clear that Hurricane Ian was on its way in to Florida, and that was going to take over the news coverage once they blew this thing up, right? So that's my view. Prove me wrong. And here's a funny line from somebody named SeanMcCarthy.com, the whole Bay of Pigs thing. He says, I love that the mainstream media is, yes, the CIA did bad things in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s, but nobody was ever prosecuted and there were no reforms. So now they don't do bad things today, you conspiracy theorist. So let's just leave it at that. We've got a big show, as I said, next week on Nord Stream and Ukraine and Russia from somebody who really, really knows their stuff. And she's really special, and we're glad to have her. And then I think the following week, Tess Laurie will talk to us about her life as a COVID heretic, the important work she's done, and probably more about the vaccines too. So do stay critical, and we'll see you.